The woman who sold Ethan Walker a dead garage for $2,000 laughed before the ink was dry, and that was the part his daughter remembered. Victoria Hayes sat at the end of the glass conference table with a silver pen in her hand and the kind of smile people use when they believe a mistake belongs to someone else. Outside the windows, downtown Cleveland sat under a flat gray morning, all steel, traffic, and cold light. Inside the room, everything looked expensive enough to make silence feel intentional. The marble floor had no scuff marks. The water glasses were aligned by height. The contract lay between them like a joke that had been printed on legal paper. Ethan wore a faded navy work shirt with one button replaced by white thread, jeans clean at the knees but worn thin at the pockets, and boots that had crossed too many garage floors to look welcome in a place like that. His 6-year-old daughter, Lily, stood beside his chair with both hands wrapped around a small red toy car. She had brought it because she brought it everywhere. Victoria noticed the toy before she noticed the child's face. Her chief operating officer, Brandon Pierce, stood near the wall with a tablet tucked under one arm, looking at Ethan the way a man looks at a problem already solved. The property was listed as a rear lot structure on an old industrial parcel near the river, 900 square feet, collapsed shelving, dead wiring, cracked glass, a roll-up door that had not opened in years, and a roof Brandon's report described as structurally inconvenient. Victoria called it simpler than that. She called it a demolition bill with walls. Ethan did not correct her. He read the final page carefully, slower than Brandon liked, then took the pen and signed his name in quiet, even letters. Victoria signed after him with one clean stroke, slid the key across the table, and said, "Congratulations, Mr. Walker. You just bought the most useless building in my portfolio." Someone at the far end of the room laughed under his breath. Brandon did not hide his smile. Lily looked up at her father, waiting to see if the words had hurt him. Ethan only folded the contract once, placed it in the inside pocket of his jacket, and picked up the key. It was old brass, heavier than it looked, with 3 small letters scratched into the darkened metal, HCW. His thumb paused there for less than a second. Victoria missed it. Brandon missed it. Everyone in that room missed it because they were too busy watching a poor single father walk away with what they believed was garbage. Ethan took Lily's hand and thanked Victoria without warmth, without anger, without asking for anything else. As he opened the conference room door, Brandon said quietly, just loud enough for the assistants to hear, "He just paid $2,000 for a cleanup problem." This time the laughter was clearer. Ethan did not turn around. Lily did. Her small fingers tightened around the toy car, and then she followed her father into the hallway. 6 months later, Victoria Hayes would offer Ethan 7 figures to step back into that same room, and by then, nobody at that table would be laughing. Ethan did not speak until they were 3 blocks away from the Hayes development building. Lily sat in the passenger seat of his old Ford pickup with the red toy car balanced on her knee, watching the office towers slide past the window like places that belonged to other people. The brass key rested in the cup holder between them, dark, scratched, and heavier than any key to a useless building had a right to be. Ethan kept one hand on the wheel and the other loose on the gearshift, his eyes steady on the road. He had learned a long time ago that anger spent too early left a man with nothing useful when work finally arrived. At 34, he had the face of someone older only in certain lights, with faint lines near his eyes from early mornings, late invoices, and years of looking closely at things most people only glanced at. He had not always been the man in the faded work shirt buying unwanted property from people who smiled while handing him the problem. Before the medical bills, before the small rental house on Fulton Avenue, before Lily learned to pour cereal without spilling because her father had already left for a 5:30 job, Ethan Walker had been one of the best restoration technicians at a specialty auto firm outside Columbus. He could listen to an engine idle for 10 seconds and hear what other men needed a diagnostic sheet to find. He could run his palm along a fender and tell whether the curve had been stamped by machine or shaped by a hand that knew exactly where the metal wanted to go. Men with frame degrees had argued with him in conference rooms and then quietly used his notes in the shop. He never minded that part. Credit was useful, but accuracy mattered more. Then Claire got sick. It happened slowly at first, then all at once, the way bad weather sometimes gathers beyond the horizon while a family is still making ordinary plans. Ethan took extra shifts, sold the second car, stopped eating lunch out, and learned the route between the hospital parking garage and the children's wing so well he could walk it half asleep. Claire died 3 years before the morning in Victoria's conference room, leaving behind a drawer full of Lily's drawings, a house that suddenly sounded too quiet, and bills with numbers that did not care how much a man was grieving. Ethan did not break. He became smaller and more precise. He packed Lily's lunch every morning, fixed neighbor cars at night, and kept a notebook where every dollar had a place to stand. The firm let him go 8 months after Claire's funeral, not because he could not do the work, but because he refused to sign off on a false history for a collector car headed to auction. The owner called it paperwork. Ethan called it a lie. People remembered the disagreement. Fewer remembered that he had been right. Since then, he had worked out of a narrow garage behind the rental house, under fluorescent lights that hummed in winter and flickered when the air turned damp. On the wall above his bench hung an old photograph of his father standing beside a rebuilt Chevelle, his hands black with grease, his smile tired but honest. Under it, in faded marker, was a sentence Ethan had heard since childhood. Some garages remember more than people do. That afternoon, after picking Lily up from school and stopping for milk, Ethan placed the brass key beneath that photograph. He stared at the letters scratched into it, HCW, and 4. The first time all day, his expression changed just enough for Lily to notice. She asked if the garage was really useless. Ethan looked at the key, then at his daughter, then at the red toy car in her hand. "No," he said quietly. "I do not think it is." The next morning, Victoria Hayes stood on the 32nd floor of her office tower looking down at the riverfront district the way a chess player looks at a board after deciding most of the pieces are already hers. Hayes Riverfront Plaza was supposed to become the largest private redevelopment project her company had attempted in 8 years, 42 acres of old industrial land converted into retail space, offices, restaurants, walking paths, and glass-fronted apartments for people who liked exposed brick as long as it had been cleaned first. The presentation deck called the district underutilized. The city council called it economic renewal. Victoria called it leverage. She had built her reputation on seeing what land could become before other firms were willing to move, and that reputation had made her disciplined, respected, and difficult to question. She did not waste time on sentiment. Old buildings were numbers. Rooflines were costs. History was useful only when it helped secure tax incentives. The garage behind the old shipping warehouse had never looked useful to her. It sat near the back edge of the parcel, half hidden behind weeds and a chain-link fence with 2 missing posts. The roof dipped low on the east side. One window had been covered with plywood so long the plywood itself had begun to warp. The roll-up door was streaked with rust from the bottom seam to the handle, and the faded sign above it had lost enough paint that no one on Victoria's team bothered reading what remained. Brandon Pierce had walked through it once with a flashlight, a city inspector, and a junior associate who kept stepping around puddles as if the floor might argue with her shoes. His report came back clean in the way Victoria preferred reports to be clean. No active tenant. No current utility value. No equipment worth cataloging. No structural reason to preserve the building. Estimated demolition and clearance cost. Between $18,000 and $24,000, depending on disposal fees. Victoria had approved the sale in less than 1 minute. $2,000 was not the point. Removing the inconvenience was the point. If a mechanic with a tired truck wanted to pay for the privilege, that was simply efficiency. Brandon had been especially pleased with that outcome. He was 39, careful with his hair, careful with his cuff links, and careful with every document that might later explain a decision he preferred no one to revisit. 3 weeks before the sale, an archive box from the county records office had arrived with prior ownership materials for the riverfront parcels. Most of it was ordinary: deeds, easements, insurance notes, environmental filings, old tax stamps. One section was marked Appendix C, prior ownership and specialized use. Brandon had removed it from the packet before sending the summary upstairs. He told himself it was irrelevant. He told himself old racing history had nothing to do with zoning. He told himself a building abandoned for years could not possibly become important after everyone with money had already walked past it. That morning, when Victoria asked whether the garage transfer was fully complete, Brandon said yes without hesitation. The deed had been recorded. The liability had been moved. The schedule was cleaner now. Victoria nodded once and turned back toward the window. Far below, beyond the lanes of traffic and the winter-brown strip of river grass, the small garage waited behind its rusted door. To Victoria, it was gone already. To Brandon, it was a buried detail. To Ethan Walker, who was driving toward it with an old brass key in his coat pocket and his daughter's red toy car on the dashboard, it was the first honest chance he had been handed in years. Ethan reached the riverfront just after 9 in the morning, when the traffic behind him had thinned and the industrial streets ahead seemed to belong to another decade. Lily sat beside him with her backpack at her feet because school did not start for another hour, and the red toy car rested on the dashboard, rolling slightly every time the pickup crossed a crack in the pavement. The garage stood behind the old shipping warehouse exactly as the sale photos had promised, and somehow worse in person. Weeds pressed through the gravel lot. A strip of gutter hung loose from the roofline. The plywood over the side window had swollen at the edges from years of rain, and the faded sign above the door looked like a memory trying not to disappear. Ethan parked near the fence and sat without moving for a moment. Most men would have seen the sagging roof first. He saw the angle of the walls. Most men would have seen rust. He saw the width of the bay door and the height of the ceiling behind it. Most men would have seen a cleanup problem. Ethan saw a building that had once been designed around work. He stepped out, helped Lily down from the passenger side, and walked to the roll-up door. The brass key turned hard in the lock, resisting at first, then giving with a dry metallic click that sounded louder than it should have in the empty lot. Ethan gripped the handle and lifted. The door rose 6 inches, caught, shuddered, and then climbed slowly with a long scrape that sent dust falling from the frame. Cold air moved out from inside, carrying the smell of concrete, old oil, mouse droppings, and time. Lily covered her nose with her sleeve but did not let go of his hand. The light entered in a low gray sheet, revealing collapsed shelves along one wall, a workbench buried under warped boards, and a floor covered in dirt thick enough to hold footprints from people who had not been there in years. Ethan did not speak. He stepped inside and looked down. The concrete was cracked near the entrance, but not in the center. In the center, under the dust, the slab was thick, level, and poured with expansion lines placed too carefully for ordinary storage. He walked 10 paces, stopped, and tapped the floor twice with the heel of his boot. The sound came back dense and solid. Lily whispered, "Is it broken?" Ethan shook his head. "No. It is stronger than it looks." He moved toward the back wall, where loose plywood covered what Brandon's report had called damaged flooring. Ethan lifted one corner and found the edge of an old hydraulic lift pit. Beneath it, sealed but intact. He crouched, brushed away dirt with his thumb, and saw iron rails running under the boards. Above him, a rusted track system crossed the ceiling, the kind used to move engines, not boxes. Near the side wall, an old ventilation duct had been patched shut with sheet metal, but the gauge was heavy and heat-rated. Whoever built this place had expected engines to run hot inside it. Ethan turned slowly, measuring the room without a tape. Lily wandered no farther than the doorway, her toy car held against her coat. Then Ethan saw the paint. Behind a leaning cabinet, under layers of dust and peeling gray, a line of letters showed through on the wall. He pulled the cabinet aside inch by inch until more of the old sign appeared. Harlow Coachworks. Private builds only. Ethan stood still for so long that Lily finally asked what it meant. He looked at the words, then at the floor, then at the ceiling rails, and the memory of his father's voice came back clean and quiet. Some garages remember more than people do. Ethan did not smile. He only took off his glove, pressed his bare fingers against the old painted letters, and understood that Victoria Hayes had not sold him an empty building. She had sold him a locked room full of questions. By noon the next day, the joke had already traveled farther than Ethan had. A local real estate blogger posted a picture of the garage from across the chain-link fence with a caption that said a single father had just bought the cheapest disaster on the riverfront, and by dinner, people who had never turned a wrench in their lives were explaining why he had ruined himself. The comments were predictable. Bad roof. Bad wiring. Bad investment. One man wrote that some people confuse hope with business. Someone else asked whether the city would make him clean it up before it fell down. Ethan saw none of it until Owen Miller sent him the link with no message attached, which was Owen's way of asking whether he should be angry on Ethan's behalf. Ethan read 3 lines, locked his phone, and set it face down on the workbench. There was a water stain above the rear corner that needed tracing before the next rain. That mattered. Strangers did not. Owen arrived that evening in a dented white van with a welder in the back, 2 paper cups of gas station coffee, and the expression of a man who had come prepared to be loyal before being convinced. He had worked beside Ethan years earlier, back when both men believed talent could protect a person from office politics. Owen had a thick gray beard, bad knees, and a habit of telling the truth in a tone that made it sound less dramatic than it was. He stood in the open bay door for almost a full minute, looking at the sagging shelves, the dusty floor, the patched ductwork, and Lily asleep on an old folding chair near the wall with her red toy car tucked under one hand. Then he said, "You paid actual money for this." Ethan was prying up warped boards from the lift pit. He did not look up. $2,000. Owen took a slow sip of coffee. "That is what I said. Actual money." Ethan slid the boards aside and pointed down. Owen stepped closer. The old hydraulic channel ran beneath the floor, dirty but straight, with mounting plates that had not shifted in decades. Owen's expression changed slightly, not enough for most people to notice, but Ethan noticed. Good mechanics could recognize another man seeing a thing clearly for the first time. "This was not a storage shed," Ethan said. Owen crouched and ran his fingers along the edge of the steel. "No," he said after a while. "It was not." They worked until the sky outside turned dark blue and the river air came cold through the broken window. Ethan patched the roof seam with temporary flashing. Owen checked the ceiling track and found the beam above it still sound. Lily woke once, watched them through half-open eyes, and asked if the garage was going to be pretty. Ethan carried her to the truck, wrapped his jacket around her shoulders, and said, "Not first." The next week became a rhythm. Ethan repaired customer cars in the mornings, picked Lily up from school at 3:15, made peanut butter sandwiches at the house, then drove back to the riverfront until she fell asleep in the chair under a clean blanket. He replaced the lock, cleared the shelves, swept the floor, labeled every old bolt and bracket worth saving, and pulled 12 contractor bags of trash from a room that still refused to feel empty. People slowed their cars near the fence. 2 city workers paused long enough to laugh. Brandon Pierce shared the blogger's post inside Hayes Development with a short message about liability finally becoming someone else's problem. Victoria saw it between meetings and smiled for less than a second before moving on. On Friday night, while clearing dirt from the lift pit, Ethan's scraper struck metal with a sound too sharp to be concrete. He stopped. Owen stopped because Ethan had stopped. Under 3 inches of packed grime, half hidden beneath the old lift rail, was a small aluminum tag fastened to the floor plate. Most of the serial number had been scratched away by time and use, but the first 4 characters remained. Ethan wiped them clean with his thumb. Owen leaned closer. Neither man spoke. The number was incomplete, but the font was hand-stamped in a style Ethan had only seen in photographs from private racing shops in the late 1960s. Lily slept 10 feet away, breathing softly under the blanket. Outside, the city kept laughing at a building it did not understand. Inside, Ethan Walker stared at four little characters and felt the first door open. The aluminum tag changed the way Ethan moved through the garage. Before that night, he had worked like a man restoring a building. After it, he worked like a man listening for something buried under the floorboards of a story. He photographed the tag, wrote the four visible characters in his notebook, and spent the next morning at the county library while Lily colored quietly beside him with a box of crayons missing half the blues. He searched old trade directories, race programs, newspaper archives, and scanned pages from automotive magazines that had once cost 35 cents and now smelled like dust and binding glue. Harlow Coachworks appeared only a handful of times, never in advertisements, never in bright copy, always in small references that sounded more like rumors than business listings. A private shop near the Cuyahoga River. Limited builds. Experimental bodies. Quiet. Contracts for men who did not want their names printed until after a car had already won. One photograph from 1969 showed Arthur Harlow standing beside a low silver coupe with his sleeves rolled to the elbow, his eyes turned away from the camera as if the person taking the picture had interrupted him mid-thought. Ethan stared at the shape of the car for a long time. The curve of the rear quarter panel matched the faded wall sketch he had uncovered behind the cabinet. The stamped style on the floor tag matched the inventory plate barely visible in the photograph. He did not tell Owen yet. He did not know enough, and Ethan had never trusted excitement before evidence. 2 evenings later, the evidence found him first. Owen was measuring the back wall for a new support brace when he stopped and looked at the tape measure. He checked it again, then walked outside, measured the building from the rear corner, came back in, and stood very still. "This wall is wrong," he said. Ethan looked up from the lift pit. "How wrong?" Owen tapped the drywall with the back of his knuckles. It sounded hollow in a way no exterior wall should. "Almost 4 feet." They removed the lower panel first, carefully, because old buildings sometimes punish impatience with rot, dust, and expensive surprises. Behind it was not insulation. It was another surface, sealed with tunyan groove boards darkened by age. Ethan found the edge, worked a pry bar into the seam, and pulled. The first board came free with a long wooden sigh. Cold, trapped air moved out from the narrow space behind it, carrying the dry smell of paper, leather, and machine oil that had not seen daylight in decades. Lily sat on the clean side of the shop floor with her red toy car in her lap, watching without speaking. Ethan switched on his work light. The beam entered a storage room no wider than a hallway but deep enough to hold 3 metal cabinets, 2 covered crates, a rolled canvas tarp, and a wooden drafting table folded against the wall. Dust lay over everything like a sheet. On the drafting table was a leather notebook, cracked at the corners, tied shut with a faded black cord. Ethan did not touch it. Right away. He looked around the room first, at the plaque stacked face down on a shelf, at the body molds leaning against the back wall, at the heavy crate stamped with the same 4 characters as the floor tag. Owen whispered something under his breath and then went quiet. Ethan finally untied the notebook. The first page carried a name written in firm blue ink, Arthur Harlow. The next pages were measurements, sketches, client initials, build notes, and dates. Halfway through, a sentence had been underlined twice. Prototype 3 was never destroyed. Stored beneath the floor until the lawsuit ends. Ethan read it once, then again, slower. The shop around him seemed to grow quieter, as if even the old walls understood what the words meant. He looked down at the concrete beneath his boots. For the first time since buying the garage, Ethan Walker was not thinking about repair. He was thinking about what kind of man hides a car under a floor, and what kind of trouble makes him believe that is the safest place in the world. By Monday morning, Ethan had 3 photographs, 12 notebook pages copied by hand, and the name of a retired automotive historian in Ann Arbor who answered the phone like a man expecting bad news. His name was Harold Bennett, and he had spent 40 years documenting private American race shops that built brilliant things before lawyers, money, and silence buried them. Ethan did not tell him everything. He described the wall sign, the stamped tag, the Harlow notebook, and the phrase about Prototype 3. Harold went quiet for so long that Ethan checked whether the call had dropped. Then the old man asked him to repeat the 4 visible characters on the plate. Ethan did. Harold exhaled once, not loudly, but with enough weight that Owen looked up from across the room. "Do not clean anything else," Harold said. "Do not move anything else. Photograph every surface. And if anyone from Hayes Development contacts you, do not sell that property back until I see what you found." Ethan thanked him and hung up. He stood in the center of the garage, phone in hand, while Lily drew a picture of the building with yellow windows and a red car parked out front. The first call from Victoria came less than 2 hours later. Ethan let it ring once, then answered. Her voice was polished, careful, and different from the voice that had laughed across the conference table. She said Hayes Development had reviewed the transaction and wanted to discuss a possible repurchase. She used phrases like administrative simplicity and revised parcel strategy. She did not use the word mistake. Ethan listened until she finished. Then he said he was not interested in selling. There was a pause just long enough to mean something. Victoria said she understood his attachment, but that old structures often created complications beyond what private owners were prepared to manage. Ethan looked at the hidden room, at the notebook sealed in a plastic sleeve, at the floor beneath which Arthur Harlow had claimed a car was waiting. "I have managed complications before," he said. That afternoon, Victoria arrived in person. Not with the open confidence she carried in her own tower, but with the controlled patience of someone entering a room that had stopped obeying her. Brandon Pierce came with her, his coat too clean for the gravel lot, his shoes avoiding every patch of mud. Owen was at the workbench. Lily sat near the side wall with headphones on, tracing the outline of her toy car on paper. Ethan met them outside the bay door. Victoria looked past him into the garage, and for the first time, she did not see a demolition bill. She saw lights working. She saw the floor cleared. She saw labeled shelves, covered artifacts, photographs pinned in sequence, and a building waking up under hands that knew what to preserve. "Mr. Walker," she said, "I am prepared to offer $75,000 today. Cash closing. You walk away with a very good return, and my company handles everything from here." Ethan did not react. Brandon glanced toward the back wall. It was quick, almost nothing, but Ethan saw it. The glance went directly to the place where the false wall had been. Ethan stepped to the workbench and picked up the sale folder. He placed it on a rolling cart between them, open to the recorded deed, the transfer disclosure, and the line stating the structure and all contents had been sold as inspected, with no retained claims by the seller. "You sold it clean," Ethan said. Victoria looked down at the papers. Brandon's face lost color in a slow, uneven way. Ethan reached beneath the folder and set one more page on top. It was a county archive copy, stamped 3 weeks before the sale, marked Appendix C, prior ownership and specialized use. Victoria read the heading once. Then she turned to Brandon. He did not speak. The garage was quiet except for the hum of Ethan's temporary lights and the soft scratch of Lily's pencil on paper. Victoria had come expecting desperation. What she met instead was preparation, and behind it, the first clear shape of something her money could not easily buy back. Harold Bennett arrived 2 days later in a tan sedan with Michigan plates, a wool coat folded over one arm, and a leather document case that looked older than most of the cars parked along the riverfront. He was 72, thin, careful with his steps, and quiet in the way people become quiet when they have spent a lifetime watching other people misunderstand important things. He stood just inside the garage door for nearly a minute before saying a word. Ethan did not rush him. Owen did not interrupt. Lily watched from her small table near the side wall, where she had written Walker Heritage Motors in red crayon across the top of a sheet of paper because she said the garage needed a real name now. Harold walked the room slowly. He studied the ceiling rails, the lift pit, the hidden storage space, the crates, the drafting table, the wall lettering, and finally the notebook. When Ethan showed him the underlined sentence about Prototype 3, Harold took off his glasses and cleaned them with a cloth he pulled from his coat pocket, though they were already clean. Arthur Harlow built 3 experimental cars between 1968 and 1971, he said. 2 were documented. 1 was believed destroyed during a legal dispute between a private racing team and an investor who wanted the design buried. He looked down at the concrete floor. If the 3rd one is here, this is not just a shop. This is a missing chapter. Ethan did not smile. He asked what came next. Harold looked at him for a moment, as if testing whether the man cared about the right things. Carefully, he said. That word became the rule for the next 4 weeks. Ethan did not tear the floor open. He mapped it. He brought in ground-penetrating radar through a university contact Harold trusted. He filed every permit properly. He photographed every mark before touching it. He called a lawyer recommended by a customer whose old pickup he had fixed twice without charging for the second repair. He turned away 2 collectors who offered quick money before seeing proof, and he turned away a streaming channel that wanted to film the discovery like a circus. Work came first. Dignity came second. Money waited its turn. The radar found a rectangular void beneath the rear slab, exactly where the notebook suggested it would be. When the concrete was cut in clean sections and lifted away, nobody spoke. Beneath the floor, wrapped in oilcloth, braced by a wooden frame, sat the low shape of a car that had not seen daylight in more than 50 years. Its body was unfinished aluminum, dull under dust but still graceful, with hand-formed curves that made Owen lower his head and laugh once without sound. Harold placed one hand on the frame rail and whispered, "There you are." Ethan stood beside Lily, who held his fingers with both hands. The car was not complete. It was better than complete. It was honest. The notes matched the parts. The tags matched the notebook. The old dispute had ended decades ago, and the documents in the hidden room established a clean line of possession through the building itself. By the time the story reached the first serious collector, it had already become larger than a discovery. It became a reason for people to come to a forgotten street by the river. Ethan restored nothing too quickly. He stabilized the prototype, catalogued the molds, and used the verified Harlow records to launch Walker Heritage Motors as a restoration and provenance shop, not with banners or speeches, but with 3 workbenches, proper lighting, hired craftsmen who had been pushed out of bigger firms, and a waiting list written by hand on yellow legal paper. The first engine he restarted was not the prototype. It was a customer's 1967 Camaro that every shop in town had given up on. The video of it turning over inside the old Harlow building spread by accident, filmed by Owen on his phone and posted by a parts supplier who understood what he was seeing. In the background, Lily's crayon sign was taped to the office window. Within a week, auction houses called. Within a month, collectors shipped cars from Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Illinois. By the end of the 2nd month, a retired designer walked through the door, looked around, and said, "This is not a garage anymore." Ethan wiped his hands on a shop towel, glanced at the old Harlow letters still visible on the wall, and answered quietly, "It never was." By the end of the 6th month, the street behind the old shipping warehouse no longer looked forgotten. Cars with out-of-state plates lined the curb before sunrise. Enclosed trailers arrived from Indiana, New York, Kentucky, and Tennessee. A coffee truck parked near the fence every morning because enough people were waiting outside Walker Heritage Motors to make it worth the permit fee. The same real estate blogger who had once mocked Ethan's purchase posted a new photo of the building with polished windows, restored brick, and the old Harlow Coachworks lettering preserved above the bay door. This time the caption said the riverfront had found its soul. Ethan did not repost it. He was under a lift, checking a fuel line on a 1970 Plymouth built for a man who had cried quietly when he saw the original paperwork Harold Bennett found in the archive. Ethan still wore the same kind of work shirt. He still packed Lily's lunch every morning. He still wrote numbers in a notebook at the kitchen table after she went to bed. The difference was that now the numbers had started moving in the other direction. Hayes Development noticed before the newspapers did. The restaurants Victoria had planned for the district began asking whether their leases would place them near the heritage shop. Investors who had ignored the riverfront called back with new questions. City officials who once treated the project like another clean redevelopment began describing it as an automotive destination. The board called an emergency meeting on a Thursday afternoon. Victoria sat at the head of the table while a consultant showed traffic projections, media value, collector tourism, retail impact, and a revised map that made one fact painfully clear. Every profitable version of Hayes Riverfront Plaza now depended on the building she had sold. No one raised his voice. That made it worse. Brandon Pierce sat 2 seats down, pale and silent, while Appendix C appeared on the screen in front of 12 directors who understood immediately what had been withheld from them. Victoria did not look at him. She looked at the map. At the small rectangle near the rear of the parcel. At the place she had once dismissed without stepping inside long enough to read the wall. The room stayed quiet for several seconds after the presentation ended. Then the board chair removed his glasses and said, "You need Mr. Walker." No one laughed after that. Victoria arrived at the garage the next morning without Brandon, without assistance, without the polished group that usually moved with her through rooms. She parked outside the fence and walked in alone. The bay doors were open. Morning light crossed the concrete floor in long clean strips. The prototype rested behind glass along the north wall, not restored into something shiny and false, but preserved with careful honesty. Men and women worked at benches under warm lights. Owen was explaining a carburetor assembly to a young apprentice. Harold Bennett sat near the office with a cup of coffee, labeling photographs. Lily was at a small desk by the window, drawing a new sign with a red car in the corner. Ethan came out from beneath the Plymouth, wiped his hands on a towel, and waited. Victoria looked at the old brass key hanging in a small frame near the office door. Beneath it was a plain metal plate that read, "Bought for $2,000. Built with what others missed." For the first time since Ethan had met her, Victoria Hayes had no sentence ready. She apologized without decoration. She said her company wanted to discuss a partnership. Ethan listened the way he had listened in the conference room 6 months earlier, quiet, steady, impossible to hurry. When she finished, he placed 2 folders on the workbench. One was a partnership proposal that would make Hayes Development a minority landlord in an automotive district built around Walker Heritage Motors. The other was an offer for Ethan to purchase the remaining riverfront parcels her board no longer trusted her to control alone. Victoria read both. Outside, another trailer rolled slowly through the gate. Lily looked up from her drawing and smiled at her father, not because she understood the deal, but because she understood the room was no longer laughing. Ethan did not humiliate Victoria. He did not need to. The engines, the waiting list, the workers, the investors, the old hidden car behind glass, and the little girl drawing in the sunlight had already done that for him. Victoria had sold him what she believed was a dead building. He had turned it into the center of a future she now had to ask permission to enter.